Good morning. It's a privilege to be among a real spiritual community. My name is Bill Drake. I work with Creating Communities Beyond Bias. Thank you for having Jamal and me visit with you this morning, and thank you for your interest in social justice. Our subject today, the racial divide. How did we get here, and what can we do? I'll give a very brief overview of racism and then look at privileges we have as white people and then address the subject of what can be done. As a spiritual community, I encourage you to hold on one hand your understanding of our oneness, our sameness, and on the other hand, the fact that there are many people in our country who are not white, who have a different experience than those of us who are. It's easy in our view of our oneness and our sameness to become insensitive to our differentness and the fact of race and racism in America. So how do we come to have the racial discord that we have today? This is not a new phenomenon. It began in 1619 when slaves were brought to Jamestown. The framers of our Constitution, 40% of whom owned slaves, wrote into that document that people in servitude and slavery were only 4/5 of a person. Black people in America suffered some 240 years of slavery and then almost a century further of harsh Jim Crow laws in the South, as well as laws that affected other non-white people, and also harsh racism in the North that was less official. So even after the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, we still have racism and discrimination in our country. It has never really gone away. Part of that is because a lot of our institutions and systems were created by white men and have been managed and run by white men for decades and generations. In 2012, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development did a massive nationwide study of housing discrimination, which made it very obvious that white people are strongly favored over equally qualified non-white people in the housing market. Other studies have shown the same thing in the employment field and other fields as well. A notable aspect of racism in America is the fact that those of us who are white have privileges over people who do not have white. Why is this so hard to see? For myself, I didn't see it for the first decades of my life because it's so pervasive. It's everywhere. It's like air and gravity. And how often do you think about air and gravity? Some people don't see it because of myths they believe, that discrimination's a thing of the past, or that it's people's own fault that they aren't able to succeed, people who are not white. Some people have the belief as white people that they're 100% responsible for all the things they've gained in their lives. Another factor is the fact that white privilege varies by a number of variables, such as religion, sexual preference, gender, and other matters. Obviously, white men in our culture have more privilege over white women. University professor Peggy McIntosh described white privilege as this invisible knapsack that we white people carry around with us. She made a list of 50 ways that she had benefited as a white person in her life. I've chosen and adapted 7 of those, which I will read for you, and I ask you to think about how they might apply to you in your life, to really try to feel how they might somehow relate to you. I can go shopping pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. I can turn on the TV or open the newspaper and see a member of my race widely represented and positively represented. Whether I use checks, cash, or credit cards, I can count on my skin color not to work against me in the appearance of financial responsibility. I do not have to educate my children about racism for their own physical safety. If I ask for the person in charge, most likely I'll see a member of my race. If I rent or purchase housing in a white neighborhood, most likely my neighbors will be friendly or at least neutral towards me. I can be sure that if I need legal or medical help, my race will not work against me. I will feel welcome and normal in the usual walks of life, social and institutional, and when traveling alone or with my spouse. So what can you do? 1, self-reflection. It's important for us to take a good look at ourselves. Raise your hand if you're familiar with Jeremy Taylor. Jeremy Taylor trains Unitarian ministers. He stated that, in his opinion, perhaps the thing that most perpetuates oppression in America is when us white liberals, and I'm a white liberal, repress our own racism and project it onto others. I don't know if it's the main thing, but I think it is definitely a factor. It's very hard to grow up in this country without at least unconscious racism. This is true of all races, but especially relevant for white people who have the position of power. We're bombarded with examples of the white people being the superior people. We've experienced that through our lives, even though things have improved in recent years. Whites have been presented to us as moving stars throughout most of our lifetime, as representatives of companies like American Airlines. And this next ad from the 60s is one of my favorites. If you can imagine being a black child or a Chinese or Hispanic child and seeing this ad of what your mother is supposed to look like. Some blacks, of course, were in some of the ads of the past. For example, this one from the California Zephyr. And of course, during much of my life, this particular crayon from Crayola was called Flesh Color. Until not even 20 years ago, in 1999, this crayon was called Indian Red. So Indians were assumed to have color of skin of this particular nature. And of course, throughout most of our lives, this Band-Aid was called Flesh Color also. Again, when things have improved, the ads in our lives have generally presented us as superior people, as white people. It's presented our leaders as white people. Throughout many of our lives, our history books have presented white men in the principal roles. If blacks are presented in mainstream media, and there have been studies on this, it's usually in the context of some sort of criminality. They're rarely presented as leaders of their community. How can we not have unconscious, at least unconscious racism within ourselves? Racism is not personal. It's something we do as human beings in our innocence, something we learn in our innocence and our inability to totally love and accept ourselves and each other unconditionally. In a sense, it's not personal, but of course its effect on the targets of racism is a personal experience for those people. The most important thing we can do as white people is to become aware of our prejudices, and I would suggest our racism. One way to do that is through meditation. Another way is through mindfulness, where you learn to observe your thoughts and your feelings and your behavior. These are just some of the ways. The more aware you are of your prejudices, the more effective you can be in the world and helping others who perhaps act on prejudice to see a different way. The more aware you are, the better ally you can be for people who are not white. You can be more honest and more real with them. So this is the first thing, self-reflection. In acknowledging our own prejudices, we need to do our best to love and accept ourselves as we are, while at the same time working to transform things in ourselves we would like to transform. It's trying to hold those in balance. This brings us to the second thing you can do, and that is to pursue your personal growth. With awareness, you can pursue personal growth to diminish your prejudice. I'll share some things I've done in my life and things that you can do. And again, I still have my area of work to do on my own conscious and unconscious racism. In my life, the first thing that really impacted me in this area was studying psychology when I was in college. That really changed my awareness of a lot of things. There's also the area of black history that can be studied. For myself, studying black literature was very helpful. There's also black music, and I spent some time studying music from the Mississippi Delta region, blues from the Delta region where my ancestors had slave plantations. If you want to study history of more local music, it's kind of evolved since then, but you have the legendary Jamal Walker Band, of course. There are also books on race relations that can be very valuable to gain perspective. Also, movies such as X for Malcolm X, a very powerful movie that you can take time watching. In addition, if you want to take your spiritual perspective, and you do have a spiritual perspective, and study it deeply, profound spiritual perspective in addition to an awareness of racism, you can't do any better than Martin Luther King in terms of his sermons and his particular writings. And of course, white privilege is a critical thing to study and become more aware of. You can form a book club, and your church might already have a book club. I'll show you a very small example one. It's in a very rural area, so it might apply a little bit, but there's one possibility there for you. And Jamal and I did give a reading list to your church, so that can be available to you if any of you wish to take a look at that. A real important area is to come to know people that you might normally be prejudiced against. And of course, you can do workshops on Unlearning Prejudice. These are some things I've done, and I'm not particularly special. They're very simple things that anybody can do in their life. I'll mention that the subtitle of my book, Almost Hereditary White Southerners' Journey Out of Racism, is a guide to healing and unlearning prejudice. And there's a whole section in that book that looks at ways we can break down barriers between ourselves and others. It has exercises and meditations, and also looks at the area of how we project things in ourselves that we don't like onto other people. And this brings us to our third thing, which is to take action in our community. If you act on a national level, I would suggest you look at the area of mass imprisonment in our country, which was begun by President Reagan. And since that time, there have been millions of black people and Hispanic people, in particular, who have been arrested and incarcerated for low-level drug crimes through the war on drugs, which has very racist overtones. And they've been arrested way out of proportion to the drug use by white people versus non-white people. And it's a major crime of our generation and something that needs to change, if there's any way to change that. But you can, of course, also work locally. Our group, Creating Communities Beyond Bias, has an annual Unity Summit where we bring together different segments of the community to look at creating unity. We do workshops in schools and so on. Your church committee can find its own thing to help create more unity in this area and help create more love and human kindness. I will give you an example of a very small protest action that is on a very local setting, just to give you a general idea. So I intentionally waited till your children left before I decided to show this particular slide. So yes, we do have systemic and institutional racism in our country. It affects white people and non-white people in every area of life. We do have white privilege, and there are ways that you can take steps to make a difference. One, by becoming more aware. Two, by working to diminish your prejudices. And thirdly, by taking action. And if you do those things, you will help create a better world. Thank you.